By 1775, the break between Britain and its American colonies was no longer theoretical. For more than a decade, tension had grown through laws, taxes, protests, and political confrontation, but none of it had yet produced a full-scale war. What existed instead was a dangerous uncertainty. Neither side believed it wanted violence. Both believed the other would eventually back down. That belief would prove false. The American Revolutionary War did not begin with a declaration of independence. It began with fear, mistrust, and a loss of control. It began when imperial authority tried to reassert itself and colonial resistance refused to yield. By the spring of 1775, Britain still considered the colonies part of the empire. Parliament did not view American leaders as revolutionaries. They were viewed as disorderly subjects, troublemakers, agitators who challenged lawful authority. From London's perspective, the solution was simple: restore order. From the colonial perspective, the threat was existential. British troops were no longer protectors, they were an occupying force. The road to armed conflict. In the years following 1763, Britain had steadily increased its involvement in colonial governance. New taxes, new enforcement mechanisms, permanent troops stationed in American cities. Each measure was justified as necessary for stability. Each was interpreted by colonists as a violation of traditional rights. The crisis escalated dramatically after the Boston Tea Party in 1773. Rather than negotiate, Parliament responded with punishment. The coercive acts, known in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts, closed Boston Harbor, altered Massachusetts' charter, and placed the colony under direct military authority. To British officials, this was discipline. To colonists, it was tyranny. Resistance intensified. Colonial assemblies coordinated for the first time. The First Continental Congress met in 1774 not to declare independence, but to demand restoration of rights. They petitioned the king. They pledged loyalty conditionally. At the same time, something more dangerous was happening. Colonial militias began preparing for violence. Weapons were stockpiled. Militia units trained quietly. Local committees replaced royal authority in many towns. This was not yet a revolution. It was a standoff. Lexington and Concord. The standoff broke in April 1775. British commanders in Boston had received intelligence that colonial militias were storing weapons in the town of Concord, Massachusetts. Their orders were clear: seize the arms, arrest rebel leaders, restore control. What they did not expect was resistance. On the morning of April 19th, British troops encountered colonial militiamen on Lexington Green. No one knows who fired first, but shots were exchanged. Men fell. The illusion of peace ended. As British forces moved toward Concord, resistance intensified. Militia units mobilized from surrounding towns. They fought from behind trees, stone walls, and buildings. The British retreat to Boston became a running battle. By the end of the day, nearly 300 British soldiers were killed or wounded. The colonies had crossed a line. War had begun. From incident to revolution. Even after Lexington and Concord, independence was not inevitable. Many colonists still hoped for reconciliation. The Second Continental Congress convened in May 1775, facing an impossible dilemma. They had taken up arms, but they still claimed loyalty to the British Crown. This contradiction defined the early phase of the war. Congress created a Continental Army not to overthrow Britain, but to defend colonial rights. They appointed a commander, a man chosen not only for military experience, but for political symbolism. Washington was a Virginian, a wealthy landowner, a former British officer. His appointment signaled unity between northern and southern colonies. It also signaled restraint. Washington was not a radical. He did not seek revolution for its own sake, but events would force his hand. British power and colonial limits. Britain entered the conflict with overwhelming advantages: the most powerful navy in the world, a professional army, global resources. The colonies had none of these. The Continental Army was poorly supplied, poorly trained, often unpaid. Militia units were unreliable, enlistments were short, desertion was common. Yet Britain faced its own limitations. It was fighting far from home. Supply lines crossed the Atlantic. Victory required not just defeating armies, but controlling territory filled with hostile populations. This was not a conventional war. It was an imperial crisis. Bunker Hill and a shift in perception. In June 1775, British forces attempted to break colonial control around Boston. The result was the Battle of Bunker Hill. The British technically won the battle. They captured the ground, but the cost was staggering. Over 1,000 British casualties, experienced officers killed, elite units weakened. For the colonies, the message was clear. British troops could be resisted. Not easily, not cheaply, but successfully. The psychological balance shifted. The King's response. In July 1775, the Continental Congress made one final attempt at reconciliation. The Olive Branch Petition affirmed loyalty to King George III and requested intervention against Parliament's policies. The response was decisive. The King refused to receive it. Instead, he declared the colonies in open rebellion. This declaration mattered. It eliminated the possibility of compromise. It criminalized resistance. It transformed political protest into treason. From this moment forward, neutrality became impossible. A war of ideas and survival. The American Revolutionary War was not simply a military conflict. It was a struggle over authority. Who had the right to govern? Parliament? The Crown? Colonial assemblies? The people themselves? At the beginning of the war, most colonists did not yet believe they were fighting for independence. They believed they were fighting to restore a balance that had been broken. But war has its own logic. Once violence begins, positions harden, compromise narrows, and ideas once considered unthinkable become necessary. By the end of 1775, the colonies were no longer protesting British rule, they were fighting it. Independence had not yet been declared, but the path toward it was already set. By the beginning of 1776, the war had already begun. Blood had been shed, armies had formed, cities were under occupation, and yet one essential question remained unresolved. What exactly were the colonies fighting for? They were resisting British authority, but resistance is not the same as independence. A rebellion can seek reform. A war can be fought for restoration. At the start of 1776, many Americans still imagined a future inside the British Empire. They wanted rights. They wanted limits on Parliament. They wanted respect as English subjects. They did not yet imagine a new nation. That changed rapidly. The failure of reconciliation. The possibility of compromise collapsed when King George III declared the colonies in rebellion. This was not merely symbolic. Under British law, rebellion was treason. From that moment forward, colonial leaders faced a stark reality. If they lost, the punishment would be severe. Property could be seized. Leaders could be executed. Political disagreement had become a criminal act. Reconciliation was no longer a realistic option. At the same time, the war was expanding. British forces had evacuated Boston, but were regrouping in New York. The empire was preparing to strike decisively. The colonies were fighting an empire without a clear political end goal. That uncertainty was dangerous. Wars require purpose. Soldiers fight differently when they know what they are fighting for. A radical idea enters the public. In January 1776, a small pamphlet appeared in Philadelphia. It was written in plain language, short sentences, direct claims. Its title was Common Sense. Its author was Thomas Paine. Paine did something no colonial leader had fully done before. He argued that independence was not only necessary but obvious. He rejected the idea that Britain had a natural right to rule America. He dismissed monarchy as an outdated system. He framed independence not as rebellion, but as common sense. This mattered. Most political arguments at the time were written for elites. Paine wrote for ordinary readers, artisans, farmers, soldiers. Within months, Common Sense sold hundreds of thousands of copies. In a population of only a few million, this was extraordinary. The pamphlet did not create revolutionary ideas, it unified them. It gave language to frustration. It turned scattered resentment into a coherent argument. Independence became discussable, then imaginable, then necessary. From loyalty to legitimacy. The most important shift in 1776 was not military, it was moral. Colonial leaders began to ask a new question, not how do we restore our rights as British subjects, but by what authority does Britain rule us at all? This was a fundamental change. If Parliament had no legitimate authority, then resistance was not rebellion, it was self-defense. If the king had abandoned